Well, we have finally made it down to beautiful but cold and extremely windy Homer, Alaska, where for the next 4 days we'll be testing out Canon's brand new RF 2-800 lens. We're comparing that today with the Canon R7, or for the next 4 days that is. What we're also going to be testing against is Canon's RF 1-500 with the 1.4 extender. And what I want to know by the end of this, at least I do, after this testing is how does the autofocus hold up on both lenses of the Canon R7? How's the image quality like between the two lenses? What is the handling like on the two lenses and ease of use as we use it out in the field? So that's what today's video is about. So let's talk about it. When this lens was first announced and I heard that it was 800 millimeters at f9, my gut reaction, my thought was just like a lot of you out there was, ouch, that's going to hurt for low light. But as I started thinking about lenses and how I shoot and what I shoot, I started to realize some more stuff about that. Is most of the time, even my 500 f4 Mark II, I'm shooting at f8 a lot of times, either at 500, 700, or 1,000 millimeters. And that's because I need the depth of field. I need to be able to see more of that bird's head. Now, I'm the kind of shooter that likes to have an eye or a beak and fall off from the front and the back anyway. I like those real shallow depth of field, so there's times I do shoot a lot of f4 where I have fall off on both sides, but if I want the whole animal or the whole head, I'm usually shooting f8. And this lens comes in at f9 at 800 millimeters. So let's talk about f-stop first. That's what I really want to talk about, f-stop, because I see a lot of misconception. Our first gut feel that f-stop is light, and that's not what f-stop's for, what aperture is for. Let's talk about aperture, because I think that's a big misconception in the community for wildlife photographers about aperture. And we refer to lenses as slow or fast. And what does that mean? Well, we refer to this lens, you'll hear all the time talking about how slow this lens is. Well, that's more of a term for more DSLR days. It still applies to mirrorless, but more for mirrorless for us, it's more of the low light situation where lens is fast or slow. So let's talk about what that is real quick about fast or slow. So you have a triangle of exposure, and you have shutter speed, aperture, and then ISO. So by being slow, what they mean is you can't shoot as fast as shutter speed, because the faster your shutter speed goes, that means your ISO needs to go up. And if your aperture is already high, you can't drop it. You can't decrease your ISO as you try to bring that shutter up, because one of your legs, your triangle, is fixed at a higher number. So if you had 2.8, you could raise that shutter, bring your ISO to a certain level, but your f8, that ISO is going to go higher because your triangle, where you're getting for your exposure. So that's where slow and fast come from. But to me, aperture is not light. So the only ways to affect light is, of course, those three things we talked about. But there's only one thing, or actually within those three pieces, that you can affect depth of field. So aperture, depth of field. And there's only three ways to affect depth of field, and neither one of those is shutter or ISO. How do you affect depth of field? Three things: distance to subject, how long your focal length is, and aperture. So that's why I say aperture is depth of field, not really light. There's other things you can do to change light, but in your exposure triangle, there's nothing you can do for depth of field besides aperture. So another thing when I talk about aperture, why I say aperture is more important with that f-stop, is because depth of field for wildlife photography, to me, is everything. When you're shooting a subject, what is behind your subject, and sometimes what is in front of your subject, is more important than your subject itself, by the fall off and the bokeh and the blur and the colors you get. Because to make your subject pop, or to make it look dramatic, is you get the area and focus you want, and then the rest of it is fall off smoother, so your image and items pop. That's why you do that shallower depth of field with these long lenses. Yes, we want more light in, so that does help a little bit, but the real thing for aperture is depth of field. And depth of field on this lens at f9 at 800 is still extremely narrow. I don't have the exact numbers on me, but I've done them before. But you know, if you're 20 yards or so, that depth of field gets really, really narrow. If you would shoot tighter depth of field, say f4, it gets really tight. I've shot sandpipers at f4, being probably 20 yards from them or less, and I can get their eye and lose their beak in the back of their body. That's how tight that is on a little 4 or 5 inch sandpiper, that it could already fall off that quick. It's less than an inch for that depth of field sometimes. So that's why I talk about aperture, is depth of field, not really light in my aspect. I can affect with the mirrorless camera the shutter and the ISO. You can shoot a lot higher shutters, why I would say it's more of a DSLR problem than ISO, because DSLRs, we couldn't shoot past 1600, 2000, 3200 before we had too much noise we could deal with. Modern mirrorless cameras, you can shoot up 10,000 and still have a good image. So that's what I mean by depth of field. So let's go out here and do some more images, and we'll talk some more with this camera, but I really want to talk about depth of field real quick, and hopefully it made some sense what I was talking about there with depth of field. But let's move on and get something else, and I got to warm up anyway because it's cold out here. Talk to you in a minute. Well, that was really fun. I had a couple eagles sitting out on a bit of rock that was on the edge of the harbor there. They were just sitting perfectly, and they were probably, I want to say they were 40, 50, 45 yards, somewhere in that range from me at the time. And the first lens I shot with, of course, was the 2-800. I framed them up just great, 800 millimeters, not a problem. It was right where I wanted, and it really, at 50 plus meters is where I start rethinking what I'm shooting, especially birds. I'll be honest with you, a small bird, a finch or sparrow, I wouldn't shoot that thing past 20 yards because now my detail goes away. The eagles at 50 yards, it's questionable, but they were framed quite well. But dragging this guy out at 800 was nice. The compression, the depth of field looked really good at that range. So I was really, really happy with the way that looked. I thought the blur in the background, the depth of field was great. It got just enough of the eagle's head right there, not a problem. Now again, remember how we increase our depth of field is get farther away from our subject and our depth of field starts growing with our long focal lengths. The closer it gets, the narrower it gets. So out there, I had enough depth of field to get the full body and the head and the shoulders of at least one of the eagles. I couldn't really get both of them in focus, but I got close to getting both in focus. So it was really nice. I probably had to go to f/16. I probably still couldn't have got them both in focus. They were too far away from each other, but they were stacked up really pretty. So then I swapped out the RF 1-500 with the 1.4 extender. So what does that give me? It gives me 700 millimeters at f10, or the other one's 800 millimeters at f9. And immediate look at the viewfinder, 700, 800, which is actually 160 millimeters difference between two lenses with the crop factor camera, as I noticed real quickly was, yes, the eagles are smaller, but I also noticed that my bokeh rendering was different behind the eagles and in front of the eagles. It was a little touch busier, not horrible, but I could really see it in the frame. So I noticed that really quickly, that difference right there from 700 to 800. As far as the image quality, you look at the images, thought they're really comparable right off the bat. And I also shot the 1 to 500 without the teleconverter at 500 millimeters, and I shot this lens at 500 millimeters. So what does that give you? Well, on the RF 1 to 500, you're at 7.1 at 500 millimeters. On this lens, you're at f8. That's a third of a stop difference. Not really that big. When you're shooting the two, you know, it wasn't as noticeable as the 700, 800 at 9 and 10, because again, the 800 at 9 has got a lot of advantage over 700 at 10 as far as depth of field. Remember, depth of field is the biggest thing I'm really concerned about with my subjects. So at 500, it started to narrow the gap. We're 1/3 a stop difference on the two, but not a big deal. And what does 1/3 of a stop mean when you start looking at ISO? Well, you're talking about 6,400 to 8,000, or, you know, it doesn't really matter until you have to get in those higher ranges. You go to 1280 to 1600. That's where you start to see 1/3 of a stop stuff could really be a big deal. But if you're shooting those anyway, you probably got problems anyhow. That's what I saw with the eagles. I really thought that the 2 to 800, and a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is at that 500 to 800 range, or the 500, 700 on the other lens. I'm not really as concerned about anything shorter than that. We will talk about that a little bit later, but to me, most of my encounters are 400 to 1,000 millimeters. Depends on which lens, because I'm shooting my 500 to 4, I can shoot 1,000 with the 2x extender. And that was really nice. Now, one more thing I did is I put a 1.4 extender on this guy, which put me way out there, like 600 millimeters. It looked good. I was really surprised. I didn't know what to expect from that, but of course, when I put it on and looked through there all the way out, these guys filled the frame out quite well. Both eagles did. And I think the image quality looked good. Okay, before we move on to the autofocus section about this lens, and you guys are enjoying the channel, liking the content, find yourself coming back from time to time, please subscribe to the channel. And that just helps us out to do more of this type stuff and grow as a channel here for Wild Alaska. And even more so right now because this happened. And yes, that was a very expensive mistake, a very expensive oopsie. That was about a $1,500 oopsies there. Basically, I broke my Sony lens that I use for this talking head stuff, and I also broke the Polar Pro filters on top of this. It's about $1,500. So yeah, think about becoming a member of the channel, subscribe to the channel. Those kind of things help us, because things like this does happen, makes it expensive trips. But anyway, on to the autofocus. Talk to you here in a minute. Okay, autofocus performance of this lens. So first, let's talk quickly about autofocus on the Canon R7. The R7, like any crop sensor or slower sensor mirrorless camera, will perform less favorably in low light or low contrast situations with its focus. So why is that? Well, the Canon dual pixel raw focus system looks at each pixel, which contains 2 photodiodes, and compares the two to each other. If they match exactly the same, then that pixel is considered in focus. If the focal point is on that pixel and they don't match, then it sends a signal to the processor and the motors saying, change your focus, back to or away from where you're at, to get us in the focus point until the 2 photodiodes match. And in low light or low contrast, this makes it a tad more difficult to match. And the slower the sensor is to determine match, causes a catch-up time from the processor and so on. How do you overcome this? Well, mainly raise your exposure or anything else that will give you more contrast in your subject to acquire the lock. Knowing this and how to autofocus, and I made 2 videos about this subject, one on how to use the autofocus in the field in the R7, and another one about why the AF acts the way it does. What a lot of people are seeing, which is exaggerated at times on the R7, but happens on all subject text, on all camera brands, is you have that miss where the autofocus wants to go somewhere else, like behind or through it, or kind of starts pulsing. if you ever hit your autofocus and you see that start to happen, it goes somewhere else or it starts to come back, but it's kind of getting lost there. Once you see that happen, get your finger off the autofocus button, hit it again, which basically is like turn it off, turn it back on. So when it first does it, no matter what you do, if you just keep holding it when it starts happening, it's never going to hit. Maybe it eventually may come to it, but it's going to sit there and do all this. It's trying to lock something else. The algorithm said, I see something else. So what you do is you take your finger off, put it right back on real quickly if it attacks. So then it should lock. If it doesn't, it's still doing what it was doing there. And stop doing that. Go to single point, go to something near the animal or right to the bird, get it close enough or on it, and then hit it again, and now it's going to lock. So that little bit of miss with that dual pixel sitting there trying to match the two, if the subject text says, I see a bird, and it says, I see something else, with that slower speed, it's going to start kind of getting lost in there. It's just going to happen. And it happened. It happened with the R7, happens with the R5, happens with the Z9, Z8, all those cameras. I've seen it on the Sony happen too. So that's how you kind of overcome it, and that's the issues. But again, I really don't experience many of these issues because I know how to overcome those things. When I see them start to happen, I can overcome those things. So learn your camera, know its capabilities, and then you'll be okay. Also remember, with larger magnification and distance, detail becomes less prevalent, and the dual pixel match can have issues when you're at a longer distance because it doesn't have much to look at to compare the two pixels to when the detail's not as good out there when it's saying, are you in focus? All right, now with all that other way about the autofocus and how the R7 reacts, let's look at the EVF footage to see how sticky and how quickly it acquires autofocus. We're going to do what I normally don't do. I'm going to hold that autofocus button down the whole time to watch it just try to stay on that bird the whole time. Normally if my bird's within the focal plane, not moving, I would get focused and get off and take my stills, and then that's what I do. Now if it's moving like this one around, I'd have to keep my finger on it to make sure I keep the lock on the eye. So let's watch what happens, see how sticky it is and how quickly it reacts. Boom, jumped on it. Go out of frame, still there. So when it loses the head, you see the boxes go around the body. So it's still got the bird, but it doesn't see the head, so it doesn't know to give an eye lock like the small box on the back of the head, because what Canon will do is lock the body, the head, or the eye. So this is the head it's locking. Turns his head, we ought to get the eye lock. See, the eye lock was there just for a second. Let's run this back and watch this frame by frame for giggles. So body lock, a lot of motion blur, because remember 1/50th of a second where we're recording with this EVF at 24 frames a second, so that's why we get that blur in there. And when we're shooting stills at 1/1600, so I won't get that blur. So it's still body, and then it's going to see the eye, jumps to the head, then to the eye. So that's the way it does it. And once it loses the out of frame where it's going here, it'll lose the head and the eye, and it will jump to the body. Well, you see that box not near the eye? That's just a UI thing. It's still saying I'm locking the eye. It's just telling you it locks out. It's got that small box. All small box means is I see an eye. It won't exactly be on the spot. Sometimes that's a UI thing, because this is happening extremely fast. Because I'll watch this in real time. You'll see what I'm saying. This is split second stuff. So that's what it is. See what else we find. Lock this bird up. Did really well. So far I'm not seeing any problem with autofocus. And this is reminiscent of what I had all day long. Here's this one here. Turns his head away, locks the body, locking the eye. We're still locking the back bird even though the bird came in front of it, because I just leave it on default and that really works pretty good for me. Here's a bird way in the background. Look, lock that bird up without a hitch. Another one that's way out there, locked him up like a charm. So what's happening here, this is how I normally would shoot. So normally what I would shoot is I'd get that lock, hold it, and I'd let off and let it do it. So I was getting the lock on there to show you guys the EVF with the autofocus locking the bird. But then I got into my normal shooting mode in my head and said, okay, I'm going to shoot this bird because this is a good looking bird. I like this background behind it. It looks really good, the blues and purples and the gold. I'm going to shoot some good shots of this, because really the shots I was shooting this weekend were just to get examples of stuff, not really to go out and get a banger for a wall hanger or anything. But when I saw this, I thought, hey, let me get some good shots of this bird. So that's what I did. So you notice I let the button off because I got my focal plane, which is pretty deep for this bird where he's sitting. He's farther away from me, so my focal plane's a lot wider. So I know as long as he didn't move too away from me, I'm in lock, and you'll see that it stays in there, and I'll stop it when I'm not holding the autofocus, but I'm still in the focal plane. So shooting a few, and see I let off the button. But what you'll notice when I let off the button, look, that bird is still in the focal plane. So as long as that bird doesn't move to me or away from me or too far left or right, he's going to be in the focal plane. So watch. See, even when he turned his head there, that eye was still, see, he's still in the focal plane. When he turned his head to go that way, if he would have moved farther that way, then I would hit the button again to get him. But he's going to fly off probably, see. But that's how I normally shoot. Get your focal plane, and if the bird's not moving out of that focal plane, get your finger off of it. That way you don't have that autofocus on any camera, especially the R7, to try to jump somewhere else. You don't give it the opportunity to fail on you because you're controlling it. Try to control it. That's why I shoot manual. That's why I do the autofocus the way I do, so I can control it more than letting the camera try to figure it out sometimes. Because if it fails, then I've got to recover some other way. All right, we'll look at one more bird, the autofocus, and we'll wrap it up and move on to another subject. So I grabbed his tail first, grabbed his eye. Every time his head turns my way, it's locking that eye. Turn back to the right, it's locking that eye. And he's way in the shadow, so it's doing really good in my opinion. So it does lose it there for a second. You notice how I went out of focus there, but what happened was I put my finger off back on again. So it was in focus, in focus, in focus. It started to go out of focus. I let off, I just literally just, I mean, as quick as I could, let off and hit it again. And you notice it goes right back in focus. So let me run that back and show it to you again when it happens. This is what you do. If the focus does decide it wants to shift away for whatever reason the algorithm's doing, take your finger off, put it right back on instantly. And what you see is, you almost can't tell that I took my finger off, put it back on, but that's what I did. You can kind of see when it jumps there. So it's fixing to come up, or it goes out of focus here, right along in here somewhere. See, it went out. Boom, I put my finger off, put it right back on, and it jumped right back to the bird. So if it ever does that, you're good. Now, what's going on here, as you can see, is on that tail and everything in there, it's such a low contrast situation there. And let me get it back where it was really low contrast. So it's back here. So you're in this situation right here. See how low contrast that is and how it kind of starting to blend in with some other stuff in the thing. There's not enough contrast in that bird. What I should have done in this situation, because look how gray my snow is, all these things I talked about. If I was shooting this for real, I probably would have jumped this up to 800 to 1000 on the ISO. Would have gave me a lot better snow and more contrast to my bird. But again, I'm shooting for examples, not really shooting for that. So this is what happens. You don't have good contrast. That'll happen. You can lose focus and get back on it. But easily, it was real quick to correct that real quickly with that. So you can see here, it's hanging on for dear life. It's doing really well. Even those birds moving all around, I've got really bad light on the subject. It's hanging on quite well. All right, what do I think of the autofocus performance on the 2-800 lens? Well, it acts just like all my other lenses that I use on the Canon R7. No difference whatsoever. Once you understand how the autofocus works on each camera, especially the R7, what you do to kind of overcome the little funky things that it does at times, you don't have a problem. You can see in that one example, it lost focus. I saw it starting to happen, let off, pop back on, jumped right back on it. So it works really good. It reminds me just like the RF 1-400, reminds me of the 1-500 with and without teleconverter. With the teleconverter, I really didn't notice much difference on the 1-500 with the teleconverter. And I ran the teleconverter on these 2-800 with the 1.4. The autofocus looked exactly the same. I didn't see much difference on it. So they've done really well with making these motors, these USM motors, these dual nanos in these guys work great. So works good. I'm happy with it. I can't fault it there whatsoever as far as autofocus on this lens. Looks good. Well, everyone, that is the wrap up to part 1 to the review of the 200-800 lens with the Canon R7 and the comparisons against the 1-500 RF lens. Part 2 will include image stabilization and video, image quality, which is the biggest part of all the stuff we want to know about. How is the image quality of this 2-800 versus the 1-500? How I think the handling performance of this lens is, my likes, dislikes about this lens, and what my thoughts are, and my wrap up comparing the 1-500 to this 2-800. What is my conclusion on that? So watch for that part 2. Should be coming out on Tuesday, probably just about 3 days from now. Watch that video. And again, as always, guys, get outside and go run that shutter.